Netcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is Twit.
Bandwidth for Know-How is brought to you by CacheFly.
Today on Know-How, trust no one. Welcome to Know-How. It's a Twitch show where we build, bend, break, and upgrade. I am Father Robert Balacer, and it's a special kind of Know-How today, more of a public service announcement. You see, something has happened in the world of security, something that has greatly disturbed the force. Now, if only there was some person we could turn to, someone who is well-versed in security, someone who is our own personal security guru. Oh my goodness, here it is. It's Mr. Steve Gibson himself, of course, from grc.com, the creator of such products as Shields Up and SpinRite, and coming soon, Squirrel. Steve, how are you, my friend?
Yo, Padre, I'm great to be hanging out with you for the next hour. I'm looking forward to it.
Now, I normally only get to speak with you when I'm subbing in for Leo for security now, so it's a special treat for me to have you live here on Know-How.
And actually, wait a minute. Come to think of it, is that going to be happening in the next couple of weeks?
Yes, it is. Anytime Leo goes away, I am the first hand up when they say,
well, we'll call this our warm-up then.
Exactly,
yes.
Yeah. We're just kind of flexing a little bit, getting ready for the summer breeze. But, Steve, the reason why we have you here is because something interesting has happened on the front of world privacy. Now, I don't want to be like a lot of reactionary podcasts and newscasts out there who have been saying that this is the worst thing ever, this is horrible, it is bad, but as you and I know, this has sort of been a general progression leading up to where we are now.
Yes. So, yes, what you're referring to is that last Thursday, so a week ago, there was the U.S. omnibus spending bill authorizing the $1.3 trillion in spending that's going to keep the U.S. funded through next September was passed by both houses of Congress, and our President Trump blessed it and said, yes, this is all now the law of the land. It was 2,200 pages, and what disturbs us is that, as often happens, but not for things that we really care that much about, there was a little piece of legislation that was initially introduced in February that was snuck into this, known as the Cloud, C-L-O-U-D Act, and it became law, just sort of because all of the other 2,100 and some odd pages had to happen. And so, we always sort of hear about this as the way laws are passed and no one has a chance to look at that stack that's on the screen right now. Nobody read that. So, multiple committees all push stuff together. Somewhere in there is some legislation which is said to have been the result of Microsoft's fighting the government's request for information about a Microsoft customer whose email was stored offshore in Ireland 5 years ago. The government didn't like the fact that Microsoft was able to make a pretty good case for why they shouldn't have access to it. Yeah. So this removes that barrier.
I was going to mention that because it wasn't just Microsoft fighting the U.S. government. It was Microsoft winning. Microsoft was actually making great legal arguments saying, wait a minute. You have no jurisdiction over a data center in Ireland, especially since you may remember this from, 2.5 years ago when this first started being a thing. Microsoft actually went through the process of removing all access for themselves. They said, we don't actually control the data. The data is controlled by an entity in Ireland. We go to them to request it. So it's not as if we have any direct access to the data that you want. Well, this was the U.S. government saying, oh, really? Okay, well, we'll get around that.
So, yeah, so the people who are focused and concerned about privacy, like the EFF, their heads are exploding. When this legislation first appeared in February, they were dead set against it. Now, of course, they're really unhappy. And, in the U.S., the Constitution provides in the Fourth Amendment protection against unwarranted search and seizure. And those who are worried about what this means, their position is that this is a backdoor around, essentially an end run around our Fourth Amendment protection, which as a consequence of this so-called clarification, that's what the C of cloud stands for, the clarification, because, we weren't sure before. Now we're just going to make it law.
Right.
Now now it's very clear.
It's got such a wonderful name, too. The Clarifying Lawful Overseas Use of Data. That's the cloud. I mean, the cloud
sometimes
is your friend.
acronyms really do work for you. And in this case, yes, the Cloud Act.
Now, of course, you're talking about the removal of Fourth Amendment protections. In a nutshell, what this does is it means any piece of data, anything that any company in the United States has that's stored in the cloud, stored on servers, in other words, connected to the internet, can now be accessed without a warrant. And that's the big problem. Without a warrant is the part that is just driving people crazy, especially EFF.
Yes. Law enforcement can simply say to some cloud provider, we want the data that you are storing for such and such an individual, without needing to get a judge to agree that there is reasonable cause for that request. Right. That is, all privacy is gone, essentially.
Yeah. And it's not just U.S. law enforcement. This is the other part of it that just had people kind of scratching their heads. What they've done is they've given the executive branch the power to create agreements with other law agencies across the world without any approval. So there's no list that needs to be approved. With the stroke of a pen, the president can say, so-and-so law enforcement in such and such a country, you can now make all the same requests. And they have to be filled, and there can be no notification of the party whose data is being looked at. That's the part where some of us are going, oh, yeah, okay, as you said, privacy is now dead.
Yeah. So, we could consider this maybe the inevitable evolution of the fact that governments really want to have extreme visibility into everything they can get. And so as a consequence of the fact now, and understand this wasn't debated, this wasn't discussed, this wasn't legislated. The controversial aspect of this is that it was slipped into a must-pass massive omnibus spending bill, even though this has nothing to do with that.
Yeah. Which actually does happen far more than you might expect. This is how pork makes it in.
Normally we don't care. This time we care.
Precisely. And we sounded the alarm about this. We talked about it on Twight. I know you talked about it on Security Now. And it was one of these things. I think they just realized people were so fatigued with everything else that was happening. It was one of these, this is not worth fighting. Just let this one go.
So you reached out because you and I want to talk about specific things that people who are concerned about the security and privacy of their remotely stored data, what actions and measures we can take to provide our own privacy protection for what is otherwise no longer protected.
Precisely. We have grown up with an expectation of privacy. In other words, that our service providers, Google, Facebook, whatever it might be, will make a relatively strong effort to keep what we have secure. It's our data, it's ours. They may use it for metadata for ad purposes, but that no one would have access to it. That's kind of gone to the side now. We have to assume that at any point, anyone can take a look at our data and we won't know that they've taken a look at our data.
And Apple has made a lot of noise and arguably money from being the champion of their customers' privacy. I know that what's the Apple CEO? I'm just blanking on his name.
Tim Cook?
Tim. Yeah, he was just recently attacking Zuckerberg and Facebook for Facebook's controversial policies, and I kind of watched that and I thought, well, yeah, but your business model is to sell hardware. Theirs is to sell their customers.
Yeah. He had a great dig yesterday. He was just saying, look, this is what's inevitable when your customers aren't your customers, they're your product.
Exactly.
And I think the Cambridge Analytica story actually brought that out for a lot of people who hadn't been paying attention to this, which is,
yes,
well, yeah, that's, of course Facebook did that because that's how they make their money. And to a lot of people, you and I included, this is just sort of the natural evolution of what we saw the minute services started ending up on the cloud. Of course, law enforcement is going to want to take a peek. Of course, they're gonna love the immediate access to any data that they want, and of course, they'd like to be able to do it without a warrant because warrants are slow and they take time.
Well, and somewhat controversially, of course, Google and Gmail are known to be looking into what you're doing because that's how they arrange advertising and profiling. And so, some people are a little worried or upset that Google is looking at the content of their email, but that's the bargain you make for having an otherwise robust and useful and well-known free email system with a lot of storage.
Precisely. Now, I know people are going to immediately think of emails. They're immediately going to think of things like Dropbox, and they're going to say, okay, well, all that data is now accessible by any law enforcement agency that has the authorization of the president. But I want to, before we get to that, Steve, I do want to take a look at something that a lot of people overlook, and you did bring it up. It's what providers like Google actually make their money off of. It's the metadata. It's some of the data that you may not consider is now accessible by law enforcement across the world. I want to use Google as an example because it's the most beautiful example that there is. But just be aware that every provider of cloud services can do the same thing, and services like Yahoo or Facebook make their money by doing it. If you could go to my screen, Alex, this is the history.google.com. So if you go to history.google.com, you will get to your activity. Now, I turned this all back on so that we could do this episode. I normally have these things turned off by default, but as you can see, it's giving me this wonderful view of literally everything that I have done in the Google ecosystem. This includes apps that I've run on my phone or my Chromebook, all the sites I visited. It will look at my YouTube history. It's pretty comprehensive. I mean, this is the history of my time on the web. And in fact, if you go down into the activities themselves, one of my favorite is the timeline. So this is all the times that I've forgotten to turn off my phone or turn off location. And it pegged me. And this goes back several years. Now, I was good enough where every time I've gone into Africa, my phone's been offline. And most of the time that I've gone into Europe, my phone's been offline. But I don't always remember. And Steve, that's the kind of insidious thing about this.
Yeah.
I mean, it seems innocent, but from this, you can get a pretty good idea of what I'm doing because you know all my locations.
So our listeners should picture their own data, that is this same information for themselves being available on request by any agency now in the world.
Oh, wow. It got my trip in Malta. I didn't. How did it do that? I thought that was off. Okay,
well,
so
and of course, and we also know, any iOS user, I'm iOS, you're constantly being pushed to turn on location services. When you update to iOS, Bluetooth gets flipped back on, because you must have meant to have it on. I mean, so there's an active push, even with, in this case, Apple, but just sort of generally. And of course, we just covered the story about how Facebook Messenger was surreptitiously doing text and call logging without obtaining their users' permission first. So it really is us versus the massive data collectors and aggregators and, net.
Yeah. And I mean, this is where they make their money because they can sell this to advertisers. And as we learned from the Cambridge Analytica story, when advertisers have this kind of information, they can develop a profile of you and they know exactly how to pitch to you, when to pitch to you. Yeah.
Well, and of course, Google is one and owns DoubleClick. And so, all they have to do is hand it across the aisle.
Precisely. I'm bringing this up because this is probably the easiest way for you to start taking back some of your privacy. If you go back to my screen, if you go into your activity control, you can actually turn all of this off. Now, it will tell you every time you do this, it's going to say, are you sure you want to do this? And that's because you're essentially telling Google or whoever, I don't want you to be able to sell this information about me anymore. Now, Google is actually very clear, though. They say, if you turn this off, we will stop tracking it in this view. We will no longer have all of this information in this history. However, they do still collect it. They just don't store it for a while. There is no way to actually completely turn this off. There is... If law enforcement asks for it, there is still data that they can get from you and about you, even if you have all of these settings turned off. That's another one of those. Yeah, just so you know. Okay, now I'm fully paused, so Google is technically no longer collecting information about me, although they still can. Steve, do you go through the trouble of turning everything off? I normally turn things off for power consumption savings rather than because I'm that concerned. Right. I'm a little more like Leo in that, I'm sort of an open book. There's nothing I'm doing that is nefarious or that I'm that worried about anyone, knowing about. So I'm not as concerned, although I know from lots of communication, for example, with Security Now's listeners, that there are many people who this really upsets. Yeah. So I get that completely. Yeah, and unfortunately, if you have a cell phone, which everybody does because we're all mobile now, there is automatically metadata being collected about you that is very sensitive.
Yeah,
it's automatic.
Yeah. Now where I'm sure I'm probably much more aligned with many people is, for example, if I want to store any sensitive data off-site, then it's a different story. I mean, it's like, where I had lunch yesterday, okay, fine. But, for example, backing up my company's accounting data, that's, or any corporate records or source code that is not, that has proprietary content, that's a whole different story for me.
Yeah, and actually, let's go ahead and move into that because that's the part of the story that I think most people are going to immediately recognize, and that's when you put things into a Dropbox or a OneDrive, or when you send an attachment to somebody, or if it touches any service that is on the internet. This act does not change the fact that they were probably looking at it before. But hopefully what it will do is it will encourage people to start thinking seriously about the privacy of the data that they do put into the cloud. I want to show a quick video for you, Steve. This is outdated. This is when this company was just a startup. They are no longer a startup. But it was one of the first companies that I interviewed that understood the whole trust no one idea. So if you would push that magic button, Alex, this is CloudMask.
These days, if you're going to be pushing data up into the cloud, you have to worry about the breach. What happens when inevitably the provider that you trust to take care of your data loses control? Well, here at CloudMask, they've got a solution, which is give them gibberish. I'm speaking with Tarek, who's going to explain what their solution does. Tarek, this is not really encryption. This is a transparent layer of data protection.
Correct. So what we provide our users is ability they can go and use any cloud vendor just like the way they use today. Now, behind the scene, as they're inputting their data into a system, we're swapping their data with something that's totally meaningless. So if I'm using Google or Dropbox, all I see from Google Insider, if I was inspecting even within memory, all I see is data that's useless. It only comes back to its meaningful information when I send it to somebody that I trust, somebody that's actually in my circle of trust, and only then it becomes back to its useful information.
There are a few things I really like about the solution. First, it uses a really, really strong, well, I'm going to call it encryption. You call it substitution, but basically it's unbreakable. There is no algorithm that you can brute force. This substitution is, unless someone has the key, they're not getting in. The second thing is, because you've uploaded gibberish to the cloud provider, and it means nothing except to those that are either you or the people you trust, it means that if that provider does get breached, someone will get data that looks like it's from you, but it is really meaningless. They'll be scratching their heads.
Absolutely. And I think we can't stress enough that just because it's simple to use doesn't mean it's less secure. In fact, it is arguably more secure. So we actually started from a government implementation, and we made it simple enough to scale down even to individual consumers. So now an average user can get the same security and the same strong algorithms that a sophisticated government department actually able to use.
Tarek, now if they wanted to find out more about Cloudware, more about what you do, more about your technology, where can they go?
So I think the best place is to visit our website. We do have a free version you can download, and you can use it today with Gmail and Google Apps. So that's the best way to start, and we're always adding functionality and support to any other application. Thank you.
Tarek, thank you very much for speaking with us. And if you really want to protect your data in the cloud age, maybe you need to get some Cloudware.
Now, what struck me about that vendor was, first of all, the banner that said "Trust No One." I was like, wait a minute, I've heard that before. It's like, I don't think you guys can use that. But it's an interesting service. Now, in the 2 years since they've gone from startup to actual company with real clients, they've kind of gotten rid of the free tier, which was disappointing. So now it's going to cost you at least $10 a month. But it was,
that's a theme I wanted to discuss with you, because I've seen the same thing happening over time, where unfortunately, as an industry, what we're seeing is this migration from, buy it once and own it, to this whole software as a service thing.
Right.
And
right.
I get it that, everybody wants to support themselves and be able to, put bread on the table and so forth. But the problem I have is that, some things make sense as a service where there's an ongoing thing that is an expense to them, which they're providing in return for your payment. But a piece of software which is standalone and performs encryption, it's like, okay, why do I have to rent this from you? I mean, it's one of the things that kind of makes my own blood boil, is that just seems wrong to me. And there were a number of apps. Early on, there was one called Boxcryptor, which was similar.
Oh, yeah, I remember that.
As its name suggests, it was encryption for Dropbox, and they expanded it so that it ran on multiple cloud services. And then they went to a next generation. You could still get the old one that was really good encryption. I mean, I'm also uncomfortable with those guys whose video you just showed, because there's like, well, hey, what does substitution mean? I know it's a little bit like, okay, well, what exactly are you doing? One of the themes of encryption is this stuff is no longer hard to do. We know this problem has been solved. Encryption and hashing and strong keys, private keys or asymmetric keys, these problems have been solved. Yeah. So building a system is no longer smoke and mirrors and hocus pocus and we came up with our own algorithm that no. What we just want is a good, solid, open, well-described implementation where everybody can see what it does. And again, I don't have any problem with people selling their solution if they want additional features to be made available, but don't ask me, like make me sign up and ding my credit card every month for the privilege.
I'm glad that you brought up that whole thing that they were claiming they're not encryption. Since they've grown up, they've removed all of that from the website. They say, okay, it's encryption, which it makes sense, because I think they were trying to set themselves apart from other companies and saying, oh no, it's not encryption, it's better than encryption. No, it's just encryption. But They did a few things right, things I think you would like, which is they allow for hold your own key, which that's what everybody really needs to do. They do not have the key in any way, shape, or form.
Yes,
and we've talked about this on Security Now. The best way to figure that out.
That is the crux of TNO. Mm-hmm. Trust no one also means you have. Not only do you have absolute security, but you also have absolute responsibility.
Precisely.
Because there's no one to go crying to if you really want nobody else to be able to get into your data, no matter how many court orders some third party is served with, and of course, unfortunately, these days, that's now I have to change my own use of language post-Cloud Act because court orders are no longer necessary,
Right.
unfortunately. So if you want no one to have access to data that you have moved off-site, you have to encrypt it pre-movement, and there's no one to go running to if you lose that key.
Yeah.
So now you are responsible.
I've had people ask me, I think I have my own key, right? I have my, and I always tell them there's a very easy way to figure it out. Go to whoever you're using and tell them that you've lost your password. If there is a way to recover it, you do not own your own key. They have it.
Yep.
They have and remember, if they have a copy of that key, the Cloud Act now says law enforcement can just get it.
Well,
Which-
and
that's
remember, famously,
scary.
we learned after the San Bernardino terrorist attack where the iPhone was restarted or they redid something. I don't remember exactly what the details were, but Apple had said, we cannot help you with the phone, but if the phone had been recently backed up to the user's
Right.
iCloud
We could have given
account,
you access to that.
that we can give you access to.
That
Yep.
raised a couple of eyebrows. It was like, wait a minute.
Uh-huh.
So it's only secure as long as it's on the device. You will give me up if I put it into the cloud. And again, where we are now is just sort of fulfilling that. It's like, yeah, of course, if you put your data on someone else's computer and that other computer is accessible by law enforcement, by nature, it means your data is accessible.
Yep.
So that's fun.
So,
But let's talk about some of the services that you actually like, because I brought this one up because we talked about them a while back, because I like the idea of a hold your own key environment. But like you, I don't like paying for my services as I go. I like to actually own them.
Okay, so yes, if there was no choice, that is, if there weren't like people who had our philosophy, who are able to write code and just wanted to be to solve this problem the way we think it should be. If there was no other choice, then fine. But there are other choices. An example is cryptomator.org, which is one of the links that I sent you, which I rediscovered when I was looking. I wanted to update myself for this conversation with you. And so, there's their site. Free client-side encryption for your cloud files. Open source software, no backdoors, no registration, per file encryption, multi-platform, Windows, Mac, Linux, iOS, Android. And under their little banner where it says transparent encryption, it says transparent encryption means you will not notice any difference in working with your files. While the vault containing your encrypted data resides somewhere in your cloud folder, Cryptomator provides a virtual hard drive through which you can access your files. You can work on this drive as if it were a conventional USB flash drive. So that's an example of doing it right on a, like today. There's no sign up, no registration, no dinging you every month for nothing, essentially. What they do is they encrypt file names and file content so that anybody who looked at your data and they're a multi-cloud provider support, so all of the various providers, all you see is gibberish file names and gibberish file content. They do note that for the sake of their synchronization, the last modified date of the file will not be encrypted. Essentially, that's the one thing they can't encrypt in order to synchronize. But so what they're doing is they've got you have a key which by its nature never needs to be shared, and you need to be careful you don't lose it. But they've got multi-platform, mobile and desktop, and now any files that you store through that mechanism are encrypted. This is, and I'm not saying I'm not necessarily recommending this, but this is a perfect example of the way I think it can and still should be done. Another way of operating would be to use a whole drive encryption, and many of our crypto or security aware listeners are certainly aware of TrueCrypt, which is the long-standing, also open source whole drive or file container encryption, because TrueCrypt can also operate in create a virtual volume in a file on my system, and everything I store in there is encrypted. TrueCrypt, of course, has now been supplanted by VeraCrypt, that essentially inherited the source. It's been through several rounds of audits. It's also free and open source. There's every reason to believe it's as solid as anything else. And one of the things that you could do would then be to clone that storage volume, storing the a volume as a file, and clone that to a cloud, and then use something like rsync or some file synchronization tool in order to keep that up to date. So again, there are very secure, zero ongoing cost solutions. And then the last one I'll mention for the Linux Unix sort of user is not free, but it's by a great guy, Colin Percival, and that's something known as, it's a tool called Tarsnap, TARSNAP.com. And what I like about it is that here it is it's a combined trust no one client-side encryption and a cloud storage solution. So whereas the first two solutions I was talking about, Cryptomator and TrueCrypt, are you provide your own encryption and then you use any cloud provider for their service. With Tarsnap, it is an all-in-one, but storage and bandwidth is charged in Pico dollars.
I like
so
that.
It's great. And Colin is a neat guy. 250 Pico dollars per byte month of encoded data. So that's 25 cents per gig per month of storage. And bandwidth is the same, 250 Pico dollars per byte of transit. So 25 cents per gig of transfer. So this makes sense if you sort of want, well, first of all, if you are more of a Linux, Unix, BSD sort of person rather than Mac or Windows. And I can, stand by what Colin has done without question. And again, nothing hidden. There is a little bit of money spent, but you can calculate exactly how much that's going to be. And there you're only paying for an actual service, the actual, transit of data and ongoing storage. But again, I'm not saying that makes more sense than perhaps using a cloud provider, because of course, as we know, many cloud services are free for like the first blob of data that they offer. And that if you are actually just storing data that you care about, most of us can fit within, a handful of gigabytes of data, and then you're being charged nothing if you take responsibility for the encryption on your side.
Right. You can still use popular cloud services for transmission of files as long as you take the encryption and the key pair thing seriously. Actually, there's a solution that we've been using for a while. I developed a while back that uses a very long key. I won't give details, that are stored on USB devices, USB storage devices that have been they've been altered, so they're read-only, and they're encased in epoxy. So the only way to get to the memory is to actually break the drive itself. And there's pairs, so every key is on two different devices, and you have to physically transport the key to the different location. So, we know this key belongs to this person, this key belongs to this person. And then there's a secondary device that they can use to sign an encrypted file. So one encrypts, the other actually gives the file some integrity. Now, this works just because we've got a very large network, and it is super secure because the key is never transmitted in any way, shape, or form over the internet. That's sort of the philosophy that we took, which is the second it touches the internet, you have to assume everyone has it. So we just make sure the key never touches the internet. That's about as secure as we could make it. I'm sure there's something that you've thought of that would be better, but this whole idea of having two specific pieces of information that literally only exist in two instances in the entire world that are never readable from anything outside of the computer doing the encryption and the decryption, that's about as good as we could come up with.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds absolutely solid. And, the one thing that we haven't talked about, and it's a little bit off topic, but it's the notion of how do you send somebody a file which you want to both send it to a specific person so that nobody else can get it. You want to verify that it's not altered, and you want to have it be secret so that nobody who sees it passing by or stores it in intermediate storage or so forth is able to access it. And of course, everything we've been talking about so far is so-called symmetric key encryption. That is, there's one master key which is used to both encrypt and decrypt, and it's up to you to keep that key. It's known as a private key or private key encryption. The alternative is public key encryption, where you create a key pair. One is private and the other is explicitly made public. And the beauty of this technology is that the other person at the other end can also create a key pair. They have a private key. They publish or give you their public key. You do the same thing, and it's then possible using this so-called asymmetric technology or public key technology for you to encrypt something using your private key and their public key, which you then send to them. Nobody who sees it or stores it or captures it or does anything with it is able to obtain any information about it, and it can only be decrypted using their private key and your public key. So it creates this double-sided, double-ended protection. When they get it and decrypt it, if it decrypts successfully, they know that in order for that to be true, it had to be encrypted using your private key that explicitly nobody else has, and their public key, so that you were able to encrypt it knowing that only they could decrypt it. And their successful decryption means that only you could encrypt it for them. It's a beautiful system, and a little bit more advanced, but it provides the ability to do the kind of things we've been talking about, the notion of secure storage, but also transfer of secured content from one party to another. And again, this is not rocket science. All this technology, all the crypto is like academically vetted. It exists. It's in libraries where with bindings to any language you could ask for. So it's just all available for use.
Not too long ago, it might have been CES. There was a company that really wanted me to come to their suite and check out their product, and they were saying it's PGP, but we have tweaked it to make it far more secure. And I'm thinking, no. So what you've done is you've taken
PGP
you've taken something that's open source and you've made it proprietary. There's no, thank you, not at all.
No, and see, yes, and I think that's the key is that 20 years ago maybe you could charge for this. I mean, like maybe it wasn't pervasive, it wasn't available, it wasn't freely and readily open. None of this stuff should be paid for any longer. These problems have been solved.
Right. And we got Specs in the chat room asking about exchanging keys on the internet, because what I just said was you have to assume if it touches the internet, everyone can see it. But that's the beauty of the public-private key pair, which is everyone has your public key. That's the point. Everyone can take the public key and use it to decrypt something that you've encoded with your private key, but your private key stays with you. So as long as you have your private key, you're fine. And only the people who you want to be able to decrypt, or who the people who use your public key to encrypt will only be able to be decrypted by your private key. Before we get there, though, I did want to show one more thing before we move to things like PGP. There was one thing we spoke about briefly before the show started, and that was maybe moving things out of the cloud. I mean, I still use the cloud. I'm not saying everyone should abandon the cloud. It's still very, very good for doing many, many things. But if you want to stay absolutely secure, one of the things that I've been doing over the last couple of years is sensitive data moves to something like this. And if you go to this is one of the smaller Synologies I have. I got about 10 of these, maybe a dozen across the world. This is a DS713 Plus. It's a 2-drive unit, but what I love about this is this sits behind a VPN. And all of the data on this is encrypted. So if you were able to take the device, it's still using my key to encrypt the data. You can't just pull things off. But it's cloud accessible, but only my cloud. It's a private cloud. I'm thinking you might actually have some people moving to something like this when they realize they can't actually trust OneDrive or Dropbox.
Well, yes, and I think that, I mean, underlying your point is that storage is no longer expensive. I mean, you know, I remember back when I was, you know, I had an IBM PC XT, and it had a 5 megabyte hard drive, no, 10 megabyte hard drive that was $5,000 for 10 megs. Well, you know, I sound like an antique. And now that drive is an antique. Today's storage costs almost nothing. So it is entirely feasible. You know, underlying your point, Padre, is that it is easy now for individuals to have multi-terabyte storage, and if you have any sort of like a co-location environment, if you have, you know, home and office, or you know, anywhere where you can move something off-site, then you can create your own cloud storage solution.
Right. Someone in the chat room is saying, I may have said that you make your private key public. I hope I didn't say that, because I really don't want people to think that. Your private key always stays with you. But we'll come back to this in a bit. Let's go ahead and move on to PGP, because I know you don't use PGP. I've actually had a PGP public key since 1997. Very few people have sent anything to me through it. I think maybe 3 people in all that time, in over 20 years, have used my public key to send me something. But the technology itself is actually still very much worth looking at. Now, so PGP was originally released in 1991, but back then it was proprietary.
Bill Zimmerman.
Very nice piece of software, but because it was proprietary, some people didn't trust it. But then in 1997, they released Open PGP, and that's actually what, when we talk about PGP, almost exclusively, it's Open PGP. There is one more version of PGP, but Open PGP is the one that what I prefer. It's become sort of the standard. And the basic, as you mentioned, is every user has a public key and a private key. Now, the public key can be used to encrypt things, but it can only be decrypted if you have the private key. And that's why you give out your public key. In fact, you may have seen in people's signatures, I don't do this anymore, but I used to have a public key block, which was just
a really annoying public key block.
My favorite part was it was almost always longer than the body of the message. And so people were complaining. They're saying, what is all this crap at the bottom of your emails? And so finally I had to put a link that people could go to so they could get the public key.
Yay.
You never did that, did you? Ever attach it?
No, and when you and I were talking about this at the top of the show, I explained that I've never been a PGP user. One reason is, first of all, as I sort of said, there's just nothing I'm normally doing. Like legal documents are still in paper and contracts and printed out and so forth, and and sent. GRC has its own server, and we use secure links between our employees. So our internal correspondence is never out in the clear. And for me, when there have been instances when I've needed to send a file to someone which needs to be secure, I do something like we were talking about with the cloud storage and TNO. There are standalone utilities. Axcrypt, AXCRYPT, is a long-standing, very good file encryption tool. So I could take a document and run it through Axcrypt with a good, strong key, and then attach that now encrypted file to a piece of email that is not itself encrypted because the attachment is. And then send it off to wherever, and then arrange to get that key, either read it over the phone or fax it, or just have met previously and agreed upon the key that we would use. And then the recipient is able to apply that same key in order to decrypt what I encrypted. And in fact, Axcrypt more recently supports public key exchange. So we don't need to have a secret private prearranged key.
Right.
Someone is able to send me their public key. I send them my public key, and then we're able to encrypt something that only the other person can decrypt. So the idea, it's for me, if you were, if you were with the NSA, well, certainly I hope if you were with the NSA, where your business was, or if you were a press person operating in a repressive country, needing to have, like where all of your communications of this sort needed to be encrypted, then I think it absolutely makes sense to deal with the overhead of encrypted email. But for most of us, most of our communication is, yeah, okay, fine, that sounds like a plan. I'll meet you for lunch tomorrow. Okay, that's just not that doesn't need to go through PGP encryption. And so I think that the idea of encrypting on demand and then attaching to non-encrypted email probably is the right trade-off for most people.
Right. And actually, I do want to show an example of that. If you go to my computer, this is Mailvelope, which I believe we showed off not too long ago. This does use the public key database. So if I import a key, I don't actually have to have it prearranged. I could put Leo Laporte, and it will actually search through the database, and it shows all the times that Leo Laporte has shown up. And actually, Leo Laporte has had a lot of these. He keeps creating and then revoking keys. But that's our Leo. We love him. And so what I could do, like this one's been revoked, that one's been revoked. Let's use this one. So I can click this. This is actually what the key looks like. All that, what looks like gibberish, that's the public key block. So if you take that and put it into a PGP program, it will use that to encrypt whatever data that you're giving to it. In this particular case, I can just click the key, and it now adds it to my keys. So these are the keys that are inside that I can readily encrypt for. I want to show this. The old way I would do it is I would just have a bunch of notepad files that had the public key blocks. And so much easier now that there's the public key exchanges. But this is how I did it back in the 90s. Before we started worrying about user experience. It's exact same technology. It's just that they've made it a little nicer. One thing that I'm a little worried about, Steve, is some of these companies have made it easier for you to use by keeping all your keys in the cloud. And as we know now, if it's in the cloud, it's owned, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. And I think if there was a lesson to take away, it would be that there is a trade-off between convenience and security. if you want more convenience, it's available, but at the cost of security. And so, for example, yes, it's convenient to have things in the cloud, convenient, but not secure to move your keys there. And so you really do, the good news is the tools are available. If you really care about security, make it fun for yourself. It doesn't have to be super inconvenient, but it does mean you're going to have some responsibility for keeping track of these things.
Right. And so I want to go through one quick client. And like you, I like having things on my computer. I'm a big fan of that. I'd like to be able to do this even if I'm completely offline. I will show the Mailvelope client just a bit because it is kind of slick. But let's show you how this works really quickly. If you go to my computer, this is the PGP program that I'm using. I'm open PGP Studio. There are a lot of choices. Just find the one that you like for the operating system that they're using. But as long as it's Open PGP, they all work the same way. One of the things that I did do, however, is I had this on a test system that had a tap. And I just wanted to make sure that the software wasn't sending anything out over my network that it shouldn't have been. And this one came back clean. This ran for a good 7 days without doing anything on the network. So I'm relatively safe using this. So I've got a couple of keys here, but let's go ahead and create a new one. So I'm going to create one. I'm going to call it GRC. Actually, no, let's not use you because it might get put into public key exchange. We're going to call it Twitty, my good friend Twitty. And we're going to make it twit@twit.tv. Now, you need to use a passphrase, so I'm going to use the ever popular 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Really hard for you to guess. Now, if you want this to expire automatically, and it's like having a self-expiring certificate, you can put a date here, which means after a certain date it will no longer work. It will no longer encrypt. However, I'm just going to go ahead and leave that empty. What that will do is it will make it a non-expiring key. Now, I've got this here, so it's created the key pair for me. In that, I've got both my public and my private key. Now, the public key is the one that I'm going to share out with everybody. The private key is the one that I'm going to hold. If I want to create something with this key, I can now go to the PGP tasks, and let's say I'm going to take the test file on the desktop called to do. Let me go ahead and encrypt this. Now, I've got a couple of different possibilities. I can encrypt, I can sign, I can encrypt and sign. This is actually an interesting feature of PGP. So if I encrypt it, it's just going to take the public key, it's going to use the public key to encrypt the data, and now you have an encrypted file that you can send off. You can either send it as an attachment, which is what I prefer to do, or you can include it in the body of the email. You can also sign, and all the sign will do is it will use your private key and then take someone else's public key and encapsulate it so that someone can prove that it was you who sent it. So that the first one increases the security of the file. The second one increases the integrity of the file. And then there's encrypt and sign, which is what I can do. Now, let's go ahead and explain how this works, Steve, because I think it's worth going through.
Yep.
Alien Vault has a wonderful tutorial on how it actually works, and they include these graphics towards the bottom that I really like. This is how a PGP will work if I just want to encrypt but not sign. So to send from Alice to Bob, let's say Alice wants to send Bob an encrypted message. You're going to start with the clear text. So this is just the clear text. I'm now going to go ahead and encrypt it with I'm going to put my public key in it. Then I'm going to take Bob's public key, which he has made public, and I'm going to encrypt that group of data. And I end up with an encrypted piece of data that, again, I can either attach or I can send it as an email. Now, when Bob receives it, it will be encrypted. He will decrypt it using his private key. Remember, he's the only one who has his private key, which will get back to clear text plus Alice's public key. So now he can say, oh, yeah, this came from Alice because that's her public key. That's just encrypting. If I want to sign, it's a little bit more complicated, and I actually really love the way that this works. It is kind of elegant. There's something about it. If I want to encrypt and sign, I start with the clear text, then I'm going to encrypt and sign it with my private key, which then gets again encrypted by Bob's public key. And then I take my public key and I encrypt it with Bob's public key and I attach it to that data. That whole cluster of data goes back to Bob. He will have to do 2 decryptions. The first time he decrypts with his private key to get my public key. And the second time he decrypts with his private key to get to another data file, which is decrypted with my public key or Alice's public key, which then gets me back to the clear text. When I first started using this, I had no idea how it worked. It seemed like magic to me, but this is actually a really good flowchart to understand how PGP works, both ingest, encrypt, and encrypt and sign.
Yep.
This is not the only place that key pair encryption is used, right?
No, and in fact, that's a perfect example of what I was referring to when I said that we now have this problem solved. These are that's a use of standard building blocks for encryption, decryption, hashing, signing, and what's so cool is that they can be linked together into various sets and sequences in order to provide all of these different services. All of it has been checked out. It's all proven. There's a next generation technology because the original PGP used RSA asymmetric keys, which, as we saw, was you were like scrolling endlessly down through the public key. You know, that thing is massive.
Right.
The next generation are so-called elliptic keys, which provide an equivalent amount of security with a vastly smaller key, and so it just makes it much more convenient in order to move keys around. Although, you know, since they're all packaged and encrypted anyway, it really doesn't matter very much. But keys do not compress by their very nature.
Right.
They are high entropy, so you know they pretty much resist any attempt to make them smaller. But I guess the point is that a flowchart like that demonstrates how these standard building blocks can be linked together in order to perform work which is useful to us.
Yeah, so let's I think I'm making people's heads spin a little bit. Let's actually show this in use. If you go back to my screen, I've got a test file here, and the test file just says this is a test of the emergency Gibson system. What I want to do is I want to encrypt this, and I want to see if the output is going to be something that I'm going to be able to understand. So I'm going to go to this test file inside, again, the OpenPGP Studio. If I can find where I put it, let's refresh this. There we go. There. Okay, test. I'm going to right-click it. I'm going to encrypt it. I'm not going to encrypt and sign. I'm just going to encrypt. And I'm going to encrypt it using the newly created public key for Twitty. So encrypt that, and there we go. So that's as long as it took. It's actually not that big of a process hog. But this is what the file looks like now.
Nice.
And this, either, again, I can send this as an attachment, or I could just copy and paste this into the email, and then they could take that and copy and paste it back into their OpenPGP client of choice and decrypt it with their public key. But one thing that you should know, this will only work for the user Twitty because it's encrypted with Twitty's public key. Only Twitty's private key can unencrypt this. Anybody who intercepts this will just get gibberish.
It's also worth noting that what it produced is not compressible either.
Precisely.
That is, anything that is encrypted, if it's done right, it is super high entropy, meaning it's all just random gibberish, literally. And I mean, it's reversibly random gibberish. You're able to decrypt it and get back what you started with. But the lesson both for text and, more importantly, for files is that you want to compress them before you encrypt them, because you'll get no compression if you try to compress something that has already been encrypted.
Precisely. Because I mean, when you're compressing, you're actually looking for repeated
Patterns.
Sequences. There's no repeated. If you go back to this, there is no repeated sequence in this. In fact, this is not actually what it is. This is not the file. It didn't convert it into strange kanji characters. This is Notepad attempting to understand it.
Yes.
It thinks it's Unicode, and it's trying to turn it into characters. That's not actually what's in the file. That's just what it's trying to represent. Let me show you something else that I think we showed off on Know How last year, which is the mail envelope. Same idea. So here I've got some of the addresses, the public keys to which I can send. I'm going to go ahead and select something. I'm going to add a file. This will not let me do files that are bigger than 50 megabytes, but okay, whatever. Now it's going to ask me, who do I want to encrypt for? And again, this is important. Remember, this is based on the public key. So I have to choose the public key for the right person. If I send Leo Laporte a file that's been encrypted for Big Brother, it won't work. He won't be able to decrypt it. So I'm going to send it to Leo Laporte and add it and encrypt it. And the same thing. So now I've got to test that TXT. Let me find where that went. And there it is. So that's just how it looks. Same thing. So this is the same sort of thing. The one thing I don't like about Mailvelope, it is super easy because it's just a Chrome plugin, and I can access it just by clicking right up here, is it is cloud-based. And I'm starting not to trust anything that's cloud-based.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Now, Steve, as wonderful as this is, as an academic experience, no one uses it. I mean, very few people use it. It's popular right now in journalism because journalists are dying around the world and they need to encrypt what they're doing. But I have talked till I was blue to friends and family. And again, as I mentioned at the top of the show, only 3 people have used my public key to send me something since 1997. Actually, this will show me. When did I make my first key? Yeah. 1998. So in June 17th of 1998 is when I made my first public key. And 3 people have used it in total. Is it just too hard?
Yeah, well, I think the problem is that email has never been encrypted. That is, like the actual email specifications for the internet have no encryption in them. And look at the web and standard web connections with HTTP versus HTTPS. It's really only the fact that encryption is completely transparent, only that it was all done for us just sort of magically, that even encrypting websites happened, and encrypting our usernames and passwords and the content on the wire. Not that many years ago on the Security Now podcast, we showed a utility called Firesheep, which was able to, in any open Wi-Fi setting, sniff all of the logged in tokens of the people in that same area surrounding you, and you were able to impersonate them and get on, like log in as them on Facebook or Google or whatever, because nobody was bothering to encrypt all of these, like the ongoing conversations with websites. Finally, now that's begun to happen, but it has not happened because any of the actual end users cared. Right. It happened because the industry cared, and the industry and the web servers and websites even begrudgingly said, "Oh, okay, fine. I guess now that you've made it free, we'll use it." So it's an odd sort of thing that much as we say we want privacy and we say we want security, it has to be done for us, or at least for most people, for it to actually happen. And with that sort of automation of security happened with the web without end users needing to do anything or know anything about it. That has not happened with email, and I don't really think that there's any sign that it's going to.
Yeah, unfortunately, you're working against the ease of use whenever you're adding in an encryption set. The only way to make the ease of use as easy as if you're just doing regular email is to store the key someplace where you don't have to remember it, which normally means up in the cloud. And if you're storing your private key in the cloud, it means your private key is known to everyone. Remember, I mentioned the private key is only for you. You're the only one who can have your private key. If you've got a tool that is storing that for you so you can access your encrypted mail everywhere. It means now with the Cloud Act that they have your private key, which means they can decrypt everything you get, which is actually worse because people now think that they're sending you something that's encrypted, signed, protected, and you're not doing your part on your side. Ultimately, Steve, this, and I've been getting to this more and more, we're getting to that point where we have to start telling people, our friends, our family, our loved ones, our colleagues, that it's not just about you. I'm not trying to encrypt. I'm not trying to protect just you. I'm trying to protect everyone that your communication touches. And as we learned from Facebook, and again from the Cambridge Analytica breach, people get information about everyone that's connected to you if they breach you. So if I'm connected to you, I have a vested interest in trying to make sure you're secure.
Yes, and once upon a time, with sort of a charming naivete, we could imagine that Big Brother wasn't actually doing this. I mean, it was sort of the stuff of science fiction. Unfortunately, the Edward Snowden revelations really put that to bed, just completely put it to rest, because now we know that there is a massive data center in Utah with a ridiculous amount of storage. We know for a fact that internet exchange nodes are being monitored. Everything is being vacuumed up and stored for possible future use. So again, it's unlikely that most people are ever going to be the subject of surveillance, but it is absolutely the case that anyone could be.
Right. And here's the advancement of the Cloud Act. This is the next step. The next step is if you have access to everyone's information without need for warrant, without need for any court proceeding, then it becomes very easy to use big data analytics to look at all that data and predict where you might have issues. And by issues, I mean everything from crime to this person's going to protest a policy that I really want to push through. I mean, you can be as Orwellian as you want here, and you can take it to whatever conclusion your mind and your lets you go to. But this was sort of the last barrier for them. They can now use all those big data tools that we've been a little bit worried about on every piece of information you have in the cloud. Now, as you mentioned, only paranoid people are going to think that the government's specifically coming for them. But I'm just paranoid enough to say, again, it's not just about protecting me. It's about protecting everybody who's connected to me and all the organizations to which I'm protected. Because if someone can impersonate me, they get access to something else.
And our intent here is not to tell everyone that they must do this or that they should be worried, but to provide an understanding of what is possible and that there are absolutely secure, free-to-use tools that if someone wants to, they're all here.
Precisely. And I think we've done a good job of making sure that this episode wasn't a sky is falling type thing. Neither of us are panicked. Neither of us are freaking out. Neither of us are saying, okay, get off the internet. You have to turn off the internet now.
I don't use PGP.
You don't use
Never
PGP.
Have.
And
just don't.
No one sends me anything with PGP. But, I mean, get practical about this. What level of discomfort are you willing to go through, not just for your own security, but for the security of the people who trust you with their security? Remember, the whole idea of trust no one is that circle of trust. Who gets in there? And it could either just be you or you could start including other people. If you're including those other people, you have to be sure that their rings are appropriately sized, which is why, again, all of my super sensitive data doesn't touch the cloud in any way. It's on a device like this. I have 10 of these. I have a bunch of larger ones that handle some of the bigger data files, but all of the ones that are 2bay, all they do is store sensitive data files. It's not videos. It's not pictures. I don't really care about that. It's the documents that contain things that cannot see the light of day. And if you're concerned about that, then this is the time for you not to panic, but to actually take this seriously. Because we've mentioned this before, Steve. This has been a long time coming.
Well, and the good news is the problems have been solved. If somebody wants to take responsibility for the security of their data, it costs nothing other than their time and attention for them to do so.
Right. And I'm just geeky enough where it's actually kind of fun. I don't know about you, but every once in a while I get inspired and I go down and I go, I bet there's a better way for me to secure this. And I'll try out different.
Cool. Yeah, it's cool stuff. Absolutely.
I mean, I almost never use PGP, but I love the fact that this public-private system actually works. And like I said, the first time I used it, it was magic. It just worked. And it kind of pushed me to understand how it works. And I realized, well, this is way more useful than just encrypting messages across email. This is a cool security scheme. I still don't understand all the math of it, but it's fascinating. Steve Gibson from grc.com. My friend, I want to thank you so very much for being with me on this episode. I can think of no one better than to have you on this one, because you've given us a very nice level tone. You've shown us a couple of options, a couple of possibilities. Could you please tell the folks where they can find you and your good work?
Always at grc.com, GibsonResearchCorporation.com.
Yeah, and don't forget that you can find Steve every Tuesday for Security Now with Leo Laporte. What time is that show? Is that still 1 or 1:30?
That's 1:30 on Tuesdays. Yep.
And in a couple of weeks, when Leo goes on vacation, I believe I get to take the seat with you again. By the way, we do own the longest episode of Security Now ever.
That's true. I had to when you began subbing for Leo, it was necessary for me to scale down the number of topics that we were going to cover, because I was watching the clock. We were having so much fun on the first one. It was like, wait a minute, we've used up 3/4 of the show on number one.
I know.
So,
well, I didn't quite have the groove down yet, and we were just geeking out so much. And I looked down at the schedule, I'm like, oh my goodness, we were supposed to be done with this in 30 seconds. It's 30 minutes.
Yeah.
But yeah. Oh, and by the way, I did want to mention David Hewlett, he plays Dr. Rodney McKay, or used to, in the Stargate franchise. He was also an actor in The Shape of Water. He is a huge fan of yours, and he has never missed an episode of Security Now. So we're
kidding. Very cool.
We're going to do something special for him.
I'm a huge Stargate fan, as everyone knows. Yep.
There you go. Yeah. Have you seen the reboot?
No, I've not. Yeah.
No.
I can recommend, however, I don't know if you've seen Star Trek Discovery. It's not free, unfortunately. It's behind the CBS All Access paywall. But wow, it is not Jean-Luc's. It's not Jean-Luc's Federation. It's a real romp.
It's not even J.J. Abrams' Federation. I mean,
no.
I haven't subscribed. I was actually waiting to subscribe for when I had time to binge.
The first season of 15 episodes is done, and Jonathan Frakes directed one of them. His name popped up on the screen. I said, "Whoa!" Because of course, Will Riker, as he is known from Next Generation.
I think he has directed an episode of every non-original series Star Trek. I know,
and the best of the Trek movies he also did. He actually has a talent for this.
He does. He does. I will admit, I shouldn't admit this, but I've watched little tidbits of Discovery on YouTube, and I'm hooked. I know it's going to be awesome. I just need to find a good day where I can just binge through the whole thing.
Yep, 15 episodes, and you are able to get a 7-day free trial and watch the whole thing in 7 days. So, I mean, easily, because, in fact, Lori and I have been doing 5 episodes per night. And so if we're 3 from the end, because we only watched 2 last night, but we'll wrap it up tonight. And it's fully recommended.
Well, the next time I get sick, that's my binge. That's typically the only time when I binge, because I can sit in bed. I can't do anything else. I might as well watch something I'll enjoy.
Perfect.
Again, Steve Gibson, thank you so very much for joining us. Folks, we know that this has been a long episode. We want to make sure that you can get to all of the information that we talked about. If you want to see the links for the products that we discussed during the show, if you want to get the details on how PGP works, if you just want to see our take on the Cloud Act, you can always find it at our show notes at twit.tv/KH. That's for Know How. Now, as long as you're there, you're going to have access to all of the episodes and the show notes, but why not subscribe? It's the best way to make sure that we can keep doing what we love doing, which is bringing you the knowledge. Just go to the subscribe menu and you can get a audio version, a video version, or a high-definition video version into your device of choice automatically each week. Also, don't forget that we are on the socials. Specifically, we're in Google+. Just go to Google+, look for Know How, and ask to join the group. I put a little process there so we can keep out the spam accounts. But once you're in, you get access to almost 12,000 Kitas. Those are our know-it-alls, people who are in every stage of their maker DIY journey. It's a nice way to ask questions, to answer questions, or maybe to post pictures and descriptions of your projects, and maybe they'll make it onto an episode of Know How. Also, don't forget that you can find me on Twitter at twitter.com/PadreSJ. If you follow me there, you can see what I'm doing even when I'm not in the studio. Like, for example, the fact that right now I'm basically bouncing back and forth between Rome every 2 weeks. It's all there, twitter.com/PadreSJ. We also have another member of our crew. I call him Sunshine. You can find Sunshine, who sits in that deep, dark hole over there, at twitter.com/ANELF3.
Excuse me, Padre. It's pronounced Alex.
You can find Sunshine Alex at twitter.com/ANELF3. Until next time, I'm Father Robert Balacer, the digital Jesuit, joined by Steve Gibson, my own personal security guru. And now that you know how, go encrypted.